Dog keeps bringing items to stranger's door. What's really going on will amaze you. It started on a crisp autumn morning in the small, sleepy town of Redford. Karen Reynolds, a retired librarian who had lived alone for the past 5 years, opened her front door to find an unexpected surprise. On her doormat lay a single, slightly damp glove. It was black, leather, and well-worn, as if it had seen years of use. Karen frowned, glancing up and down the quiet street. No one was in sight, and the morning air carried only the soft rustling of leaves. She bent down, picked up the glove, and examined it. "Odd," she murmured, bringing it inside and placing it on the kitchen counter. She thought perhaps one of the neighborhood kids had lost it, though she couldn't recall seeing anyone playing nearby. Shrugging, she tucked the glove into a drawer and went about her day. The next morning, Karen found something else waiting for her. A tennis ball, scuffed and dirty, but intact. This time, her frown deepened. It was too coincidental to dismiss. She scanned the street again, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of movement, but it was as still as the day before. By the third morning, when she opened her door to find a worn blue scarf draped neatly over her mat, Karen decided to investigate. She sat by the window in her small living room, sipping tea and keeping an eye on her front porch. Hours passed, the day slipping away in the quiet rhythm of Redford, but no one came. That night, as Karen was brushing her teeth, she heard a soft scratching sound near her front door. Her heart quickened, and she tiptoed to the window. The porch light cast a dim glow over the mat, but the area was otherwise shadowed. She peered through the glass, her breath fogging the pane, and gasped softly. There, just at the edge of the porch, was a dog. It was a scruffy mutt with a patchy coat and floppy ears, its tail wagging as it nosed at something on the ground. In its mouth, it carried a shoe, brown, scuffed, and clearly well used. The dog gently placed the shoe on the mat, then looked around as if ensuring no one was watching. Satisfied, it trotted off into the night, its silhouette vanishing down the street. Karen stood frozen, her mind racing. Who was this dog, and why was it leaving her things? The next morning, the shoe was still there, sitting neatly beside the scarf, the glove, and the tennis ball. Karen decided she couldn't let the mystery linger any longer. That afternoon, she walked to the local diner, the hub of gossip and news in Redford. Inside, she found her friend Louise, a retired schoolteacher who knew everyone in town. "You wouldn't believe what's been happening," Karen said, recounting the story. Louise's eyes widened. "A dog? Leaving things at your door?" Karen nodded. "Every night, it seems, and they're all odd items. Things that look like they've been used." Louise sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "That sounds like Jasper." "Jasper?" Karen asked. Louise leaned in, lowering her voice. "He's a stray. Been wandering around Redford for a while now. Belongs to no one, but everyone feeds him. Sweet dog, really, but no one knows where he came from." Karen frowned. "Why would he bring things to me?" "Maybe he likes you," Louise suggested with a shrug. "Or maybe he's trying to tell you something." That night, Karen left her porch light on and set up a small dish of food by the door. She wanted to see Jasper up close. Just past midnight, she heard the now familiar scratching sound. She moved quickly but quietly, peeking through the window as Jasper trotted up the steps. The dog paused, sniffing the air, his tail wagging slightly as he noticed the dish of food. He nudged it with his nose, then looked up at the door, as if expecting someone to come out. Karen hesitated for a moment before opening the door slowly. Jasper startled but didn't run. Instead, he tilted his head, his big brown eyes meeting hers. "Hello, there," Karen said softly, crouching down. "You're the one who's been leaving me all these things, aren't you?" Jasper wagged his tail and took a cautious step forward. Karen reached out her hand, letting him sniff it. He hesitated before leaning in, his wet nose brushing against her palm. She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "You're quite the mystery, aren't you?" she said. Jasper wagged his tail harder, as if in agreement. Karen noticed something odd as she looked closer at him. His coat, though patchy, showed signs of once having been cared for. His collar, frayed and worn, bore no tags but looked expensive, as though he had belonged to someone. And the items he had brought her, they weren't random. They seemed personal. "Who do you belong to, Jasper?" Karen asked, more to herself than to him. Jasper tilted his head again, then turned and trotted off into the night. The following week, Jasper's visits became routine. Every evening he would bring something new: a baseball cap, a child's toy truck, a book with a torn cover. Karen began keeping a log of the items, noting their condition and wondering about their origins. She also started leaving the door open when he arrived, letting him step inside for a few minutes to eat or rest. She couldn't help but grow attached to him. He was gentle, smart, and strangely thoughtful, always looking at her with those deep, expressive eyes. But the mystery of his nightly deliveries gnawed at her. She had to know where these items were coming from. One evening, she decided to follow him. When Jasper arrived with his latest gift, a small leather wallet, Karen quietly grabbed her coat and stepped out onto the porch. Jasper gave her a curious look, but didn't seem bothered as she trailed behind him. He trotted down the street, his steps purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Karen kept her distance, her heart racing as she followed him through the quiet town. He led her past the diner, past the library, and down a narrow alley that opened into a large, overgrown field. At the far edge of the field stood an old, abandoned house, its windows shattered and its paint peeling. Jasper stopped at the edge of the field and turned to look at Karen. He wagged his tail, as if encouraging her to follow, before trotting toward the house. Karen hesitated. The place looked eerie in the moonlight, its shadow stretching across the field like a warning. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to know what Jasper was trying to show her. Karen followed Jasper cautiously, her shoes crunching softly against the overgrown grass. The house loomed larger as she approached, its dilapidated frame shrouded in darkness. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the crumbling walls and broken windows, but Jasper seemed unbothered. He moved with purpose, weaving through the weeds and debris until he reached the front steps. He paused there, looking back at Karen with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Karen hesitated at the edge of the porch, her heart pounding. "What is this place, Jasper?" she whispered, as if the dog might answer her. He wagged his tail once, then turned and nosed at the front door. It creaked open slightly under the pressure, revealing a dim, musty interior. The smell of damp wood and mildew hit her as she stepped inside. The faint light of the moon spilled through the broken windows, casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Jasper trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he moved deeper into the house. Karen followed him through what appeared to have once been a living room. The furniture was old and decayed, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. A faded photograph sat on the mantel of a soot-streaked fireplace, but she didn't pause to inspect it. Her focus was on Jasper, who was heading toward a narrow hallway at the back of the house. "Where are you taking me?" Karen murmured, her voice trembling slightly. Jasper led her to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and he nudged it open with his nose. Beyond it was a small room, cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and various odds and ends. But what caught Karen's attention was the neat pile of items in the center of the room. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized some of them. A glove, a tennis ball, the blue scarf. Jasper had been collecting them here. Karen knelt down beside the pile, her fingers brushing over the worn leather glove she had first found on her porch. "You brought all of this here," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "But why?" Jasper let out a soft whine and moved to a corner of the room. Karen turned to follow his gaze and saw something partially hidden beneath a tattered blanket. She reached out hesitantly, pulling the fabric aside to reveal an old, locked chest. The wood was scratched and splintered, but the brass lock remained intact, its surface dull with age. Karen's pulse quickened. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" Jasper wagged his tail and barked once, the sound startling in the stillness. Karen hesitated for a moment before trying to lift the chest, but it was too heavy. Instead, she looked around the room, searching for something to break the lock. Her eyes fell on a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall. With a deep breath, she grabbed the tool and wedged it beneath the lock. Took several tries, but the lock finally gave way with a loud snap. Karen set the crowbar aside and opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of items that left her speechless. There were old photographs, some yellowed with age, showing a family. A man, a woman, and a young boy, smiling in front of the very house she now stood in. A set of dog tags rested on top of the photos, engraved with a name, Buddy. Beneath them were more personal items: a watch, a notebook, and a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. Karen picked up one of the photographs, her hands trembling. The young boy in the picture was holding a dog, a scruffy mutt that looked strikingly similar to Jasper. Her breath caught in her throat as realization dawned. "This was your family," she whispered, turning to look at Jasper. The dog sat quietly, his eyes locked on hers. There was a depth in his gaze that seemed almost human, as if he understood everything she had just discovered. Karen sifted through the letters, her curiosity driving her forward despite the weight of the moment. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "Dear Buddy, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you can forgive me. Times have been hard, and I had no choice but to leave you behind. It breaks my heart every day, and I pray that someone kind has found you. You were more than just a pet. You were my best friend, my family. I'm so sorry." The letter ended abruptly. The ink smudged as though the writer had been crying. Karen's chest tightened. She looked at Jasper. "No, Buddy," and felt a surge of emotion she hadn't experienced in years. "You've been looking for them," she said, her voice trembling. "All this time, you've been trying to find your family." Buddy let out a soft whine and nudged the pile of items with his nose. Karen realized then that the objects he had been bringing to her were all tied to his past, a fragment of a life he had lost but never forgotten. Karen sat on the dusty floor of the old house, her hands trembling as she clutched the letters and photographs. Each one painted a picture of a life filled with love and loyalty, but also heartbreak and loss. The boy in the photographs couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his smile wide and carefree as he wrapped his arms around Buddy's scruffy frame. In another picture, the boy stood beside his parents, holding Buddy's leash while the family posed in front of the very door Karen had just walked through. She glanced at Buddy, Jasper as she had known him until now, sitting quietly beside her. His tail wagged softly, his head tilted as if waiting for her to make sense of it all. It was hard to believe that the dog who had been leaving her gifts, who had wandered the streets of Redford for so long, had once been part of this family. Karen's voice was barely above a whisper. "You've been waiting, haven't you? Searching for them." Buddy let out a low whine, his gaze shifting to the chest. Karen's heart ached. She reached out to scratch behind his ears, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I don't know what happened to them, but I'll help you find out." She gathered the letters and photographs, carefully placing them back into the chest. The dog tags jingled softly as she closed the lid. "This isn't just a coincidence," she murmured. "You brought me here for a reason." The next day, Karen returned to the house with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the night poring over the letters, searching for clues about what might have happened to Buddy's family. One of the letters mentioned the father's job at a nearby factory, which had since shut down, and another spoke of the boy's love for baseball. But there were no names, no concrete details to go on, only fragments of a story that begged to be pieced together. Buddy followed her as she walked through the old house, his tail wagging softly. The house was filled with echoes of the past, each creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind telling a story. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding on something sacred. In the living room, she found a stack of newspapers, yellowed and brittle with age. She sifted through them carefully, searching for anything that might hint at the family's fate. One headline caught her eye: "Local factory closes doors, hundreds laid off." The article detailed the economic struggles that had swept through Redford decades ago, forcing many families to leave in search of work. Karen's fingers tightened around the newspaper. Could this have been what tore Buddy's family apart? Had they been forced to leave him behind in their desperation to start over? She glanced at Buddy, who was lying on the floor beside her, his head resting on his paws. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "I won't let your story end here." Karen spent the next few days visiting the town's archives and talking to anyone who might remember the family. She brought the photographs with her, showing them to old-timers at the diner and the library. Most people shook their heads, unable to recall the faces in the pictures. But one man, a retired postman named Harold, paused when he saw the boy holding Buddy. "This was the Whitaker family," he said slowly. "I used to deliver their mail back in the day. Nice folks. Shame about what happened." Karen leaned forward, her heart racing. "What happened?" Harold sighed, his weathered face filled with sadness. "It was the factory closing that did it. Mr. Whitaker lost his job, and they couldn't afford to stay. Packed up and left town in a hurry. I heard they went to stay with relatives in Ohio, but I never saw them again." "And Buddy?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. "What about him?" Harold shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe they couldn't take him with them. It was a tough time for everyone." Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. She thanked Harold and left the diner, her mind swirling with thoughts. The Whitaker family's story was one of heartbreak and survival, but it wasn't complete. She had to find out where they had gone, and if they had ever tried to come back for Buddy. That evening, Karen sat on her porch with Buddy at her feet. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. She ran her fingers through Buddy's fur, her mind heavy with questions. How long had he been waiting? How many years had he spent wandering the streets, searching for the family he had lost? "You deserved better," she said softly. Buddy looked up at her, his brown eyes filled with trust and affection. Karen felt a pang of guilt. She had grown attached to him, but she knew his heart still belonged to the Whitakers. He hadn't given up on them, and she couldn't either. The next morning, Karen made a decision. She packed the photographs, the letters, and Buddy's dog tags into a bag and set out for the town hall. She needed access to more records, anything that could help her trace the Whitakers' journey after they left Redford. It was a long shot, but she had to try. Hours turned into days as Karen combed through old documents and directories. Finally, she found something. A change of address form filed by the Whitakers shortly before they left town. It listed an address in Columbus, Ohio. Karen's heart leapt. It was a lead, the first tangible clue in her search. She returned home that evening and knelt beside Buddy. "I found them," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "Or at least I think I did. They went to Ohio. We're gonna find out if they're still there." Buddy wagged his tail, his excitement mirroring her own. For the first time since she had met him, Karen felt a spark of hope. She didn't know what they would find in Ohio, but she was determined to give Buddy the closure he deserved, whether that meant reuniting him with his family or helping him finally move on. The drive to Columbus was long, but Karen barely noticed the passing miles. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window, his tail wagging intermittently as if he sensed they were heading somewhere important. Karen had packed lightly for the trip, bringing only the essentials along with the chest of Buddy's belongings. She didn't know exactly what she would find in Ohio, but the weight of her promise to him kept her focused. As they neared the outskirts of Columbus, Karen glanced at the address she had written down. The house was in an older part of the city, nestled in a neighborhood with narrow streets lined by towering oaks. The homes were modest but well-maintained, their yards neatly trimmed. Karen's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she turned onto the street, her heart pounding. What if the Whitakers no longer lived there? What if they had moved on, or worse, what if they didn't want to be found? She pulled up in front of a small, pale yellow house with a white picket fence. The address matched the one on the form, but there was no sign of movement. Karen hesitated, then glanced at Buddy. "This is it," she said. "Let's see if they're here." She stepped out of the car, Buddy trotting faithfully beside her. The front yard was quiet, the sound of chirping birds the only indication of life. Karen walked up to the door and rang the bell, her stomach twisting in nervous anticipation. She waited, Her breath held, but there was no answer. Buddy sniffed at the porch, his nose working furiously as if he recognized something. Karen frowned and rang the bell again, then knocked lightly. After another long pause, she stepped back and looked around, her mind racing. The house didn't look abandoned, but there were no cars in the driveway, no lights visible inside. She turned to Buddy. "Maybe they're not home," she said. "Let's try the neighbors." Karen walked next door and knocked. An elderly man answered, his face lined with years but kind. She introduced herself and explained her purpose, showing him the photographs. "I'm trying to find the Whitaker family. They used to live here." The man studied the pictures, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "I remember them," he said slowly. "They moved here years ago, but they left not long after. Something about the mother getting sick and needing to live with relatives." "Do you know where they went?" Karen asked, her voice tinged with desperation. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I lost track of them after that. It's been decades. I didn't know they had a dog." Karen's shoulders sagged, but she thanked him for his time and returned to her car. She felt a pang of disappointment as she looked at Buddy, who was sitting patiently in the passenger seat, his eyes bright with hope. She stroked his head. "We'll keep trying," she promised. That evening, Karen checked into a motel and spent hours searching online for any trace of the Whitaker family. She combed through social media, old directories, and public records, but the trail seemed to grow colder with each search. By the time she closed her laptop, her eyes burned with exhaustion, and her heart felt heavy. Buddy lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, as if sensing her frustration. "I'm sorry, Buddy," she said softly. "I thought we'd find them. I thought I could give you the reunion you deserve." Buddy lifted his head and looked at her with those deep, soulful eyes. Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Even now, after everything, he hadn't lost hope. His unwavering faith gave her the strength to keep going. The next morning, Karen decided to visit the local library. She knew it was a long shot, but it was one of the few places left to search for records that might not be available online. She brought the photographs and letters with her, hoping they might help jog someone's memory. After hours of searching, a librarian approached her, intrigued by the old photographs spread across the table. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. Karen explained the story, her voice trembling as she recounted Buddy's journey and her quest to find the Whitakers. The librarian listened intently, then asked to see the photographs. She examined them closely before pointing to one of the pictures. "This boy," she said, tapping the image of the child holding Buddy. "I think I've seen his name before. It was in a newspaper article about a year ago." Karen's pulse quickened. "Do you remember the article? What was it about?" The librarian frowned in concentration. "I think it was about a fundraiser for the local animal shelter. The man in the article said he grew up with a dog that meant everything to him. I remember the story because it was so heartfelt." She moved quickly to a nearby computer and began typing. "Let me see if I can find it." Karen leaned over her shoulder, her heart pounding as the librarian scrolled through search results. Finally, she stopped and clicked on an article. A photo appeared on the screen. A middle-aged man standing in front of a shelter, smiling warmly. Karen gasped. It was the boy from the photographs, now grown. The article confirmed his name, Daniel Whitaker. It mentioned his work with animal rescues and listed his current location, a town just an hour away. Karen felt tears prick her eyes. "This is him," she whispered. "This is Buddy's boy." The librarian smiled. "It sounds like you're close to finding your answer." Karen left the library with renewed determination. She drove to the address listed in the article, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Buddy sat beside her, his tail wagging as if he could sense the importance of the moment. When they arrived, Karen parked outside a modest house with a tidy front yard. Her heart raced as she stepped out of the car, Buddy following close behind. She rang the doorbell and waited, her stomach twisting in anticipation. The door opened, and a man in his 40s stood there, his face lined with the faintest trace of the boy he had once been. His eyes widened as he looked at Karen, then shifted to Buddy. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Buddy? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. Karen's breath caught as Daniel's eyes filled with recognition and disbelief. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Buddy, who stood at Karen's side, tail wagging furiously. "Is it really him?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "Is this Buddy?" Karen nodded, her own voice unsteady. "He's been waiting for you all these years. I think he's been looking for you." Daniel crouched down, his hands outstretched. Buddy hesitated for only a moment before bounding forward, his tail whipping wildly as he reached the man who had been his boy so many years ago. Daniel wrapped his arms around Buddy, burying his face in the dog's scruffy fur. "Buddy," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I can't believe it. I thought I'd lost you forever." Karen stood back, watching the reunion with tears streaming down her face. It was as if time had folded in on itself, erasing the decades of separation and replacing them with a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. Buddy whined softly, licking Daniel's face as if to reassure him that he was real, that this wasn't just a dream. After several minutes, Daniel stood, his hands still resting on Buddy's head. He looked at Karen, his eyes brimming with gratitude. How did you find him? How is this even possible?" Karen explained everything. The items Buddy had left on her porch, the old house in Redford, the letters, and the photographs. She told him about her search for the Whitaker family, her conversations with Harold, and the trail that had led her to Columbus. Daniel listened intently, his expression a mixture of wonder and sorrow. "I never stopped thinking about him," Daniel said when she finished. "When we had to leave Redford, it broke my heart to leave Buddy behind. My parents told me we couldn't take him with us, we didn't have the money, and we were moving in with relatives who didn't allow pets. I begged them to let me stay, to find another way, but I was just a kid. I didn't have a choice." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to write him letters. I knew he couldn't read them, but it made me feel like I was still connected to him somehow. When we left, I promised I'd come back for him. But life got in the way. My mom got sick and then my dad. By the time I was old enough to make the trip, I didn't know where to start. I thought he'd be gone." Karen placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "He never gave up on you. All this time he's been waiting, searching, and somehow he found his way back." Daniel knelt beside Buddy again, his hand trembling as he scratched behind the dog's ears. "You're amazing," he said softly. "I don't deserve you." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes shining with the unconditional love that only a dog could give. Karen felt her chest tighten as she watched them, the weight of their reunion settling over her like a warm blanket. This was why Buddy had been so insistent, why he had collected those seemingly random items and left them on her porch. He had been building a trail, leading her to this moment. Daniel invited Karen inside, and they spent the next several hours talking. He showed her old photographs of the Whitaker family, including some Karen hadn't seen before, pictures of Buddy as a puppy, curled up beside a young Daniel on the couch, and others of Buddy bounding through the fields near their old home. "He was my best friend," Daniel said, his voice soft. "He got me through some of the hardest times in my life." Karen couldn't help but smile. "And now he's brought us together. It's incredible, really." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm orange glow, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I want to do something for him," he said. "Something to show him how much he means to me." Karen nodded. "What do you have in mind?" "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted. "But I want to make up for all the years he spent waiting for me. He deserves that much." Over the next few days, Daniel and Karen worked together to create a new chapter in Buddy's story. Daniel, who had spent years volunteering at animal shelters, decided to host an event in Buddy's honor, a community gathering to celebrate the unbreakable bond between people and their pets. He reached out to local shelters, businesses, and friends, and within days, the event began to take shape. The day of the gathering arrived, and the park was filled with people and their pets. Tables were set up with food, games, and information about pet adoption, and a stage had been built for Daniel to share Buddy's story. Karen stood beside him, Buddy at their feet, as they addressed the crowd. Buddy's journey is a testament to the power of love and loyalty, Daniel said, his voice carrying across the park. Even after years of separation, he never stopped searching. He taught me that it's never too late to reconnect with the ones we love. The crowd erupted in applause, and Buddy barked happily, his tail wagging as if he understood every word. Karen felt a surge of pride as she looked at the dog who had brought so many people together. He had started as a mystery, a stray with a curious habit, but he had become so much more, a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the enduring bonds that time could never break. As the event wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Daniel turned to Karen, his expression filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done," he said. "You brought Buddy back to me. You gave me a second chance." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening. "It was Buddy who led me to you. He never gave up, and neither could I." Buddy barked once, his tail wagging as he looked up at them. It was as if he was saying, "Thank you." As the three of them walked through the park, the sun setting behind them, Karen felt a deep sense of peace. Buddy's story had come full circle, and in helping him find his way home, she had found something too, a renewed belief in the power of connection, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives.